Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Advancing DEIA in Research, Guidance from Federal Funders. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're so glad that you're here. For those of you that are new to our programming, welcome. We are the Community Health Equity and Engagement and Research team. And for those of you that have joined us in the past, welcome back. We're so happy to bring today's session to you. For those of you that might not be as familiar with CHEER programming, we are basically here at Penn State across the university to support community academic partnerships and community engaged research. And one of the ways we do that is through the educational trainings and programs that we offer to both Penn State research teams as well as community partners. And we really try to learn about what the community needs are so that we can bring those research priorities here at Penn State to advance health equity, and also make sure that we are reaching marginalized populations that have in the past not always been included in research. And we're going to learn a little bit more about why that's been the case today and what some of our federal funders are doing to really move the needle and how DEIA initiatives occur in the work that they fund. I'm going to introduce our wonderful guest speakers today who bring such a wealth of expertise to this topic. So first is going to be Mr. Jason Johnson, who is a partner in Moses Singer's Healthcare and Life Sciences Practice Group and Healthcare Privacy and Cybersecurity and Intellectual Property Practices. In addition to his legal experience, Mr. Johnson has experience as a benchtop research scientist in the academic and pharmaceutical environments. Additionally, as a clinical research monitor, Mr. Johnson trained physicians and clients on FDA laws and regulations regarding the proper conduct of clinical studies. Mr. Johnson uses this practical experience to guide his clients through all aspects of healthcare privacy and research and development. Then Mr. Johnson will pass it off to Dr. Marie Bernard, who is the National Institutes of Health Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity. In this role, she leads NIH thought regarding the science of scientific workforce diversity and co-leads the development of the NIH-wide strategic plan for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and is co-leading its implementation. Before becoming in this role, Dr. Bernard was Deputy Director of the NIH National Institute on Aging and led multiple NIH-wide initiatives, including the Inclusion Governance Committee that assures inclusion of women, underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, children, and older adults in clinical trials. She also led the Women of Color Committee of the Working Group on Women in Biomedical Careers. Dr. Bernard joined NIH in 2008 after serving as the founding chair of the Donald W. Reynolds Department of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Oklahoma College of Medicine, where she established programs that foster diversity among the geriatric leadership and facilitated health disparities research. And then finally, we are joined by Dr. Tracy Wang, who is the Chief of Comparative Clinical Effectiveness Research at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, otherwise known as PCORI. She is a cardiologist and clinical researcher with expertise in observational research, implementation science, and pragmatic randomized clinical trials. Dr. Wang leads PCORI's comparative effectiveness research portfolio, focused on increasing the evidence base for existing interventions and emerging innovations to improve health outcomes and health equity through multidisciplinary research. She provides strategic guidance and oversight of ongoing programs and new initiatives designed to enhance and accelerate patient-centered comparative effectiveness research. Dr. Wang has received multiple awards recognizing her excellence in mentorship and leadership in enhancing diversity in both research participants and workforce. So thank you again. Just really want to welcome our wonderful experts here today, as you can see from those beautiful bios of the wonderful work that they've done in this space. Just for some brief logistics, the session is being recorded. Please do use the chat feature to make comments, share resources, and make connections. Also available is the Q&A feature to ask any questions to any of our panelists. We will have a Q&A portion of this webinar devoted at the end for to make sure that everyone is able to ask their questions. And then presentation materials will be shared post-session. For our learning goals and objectives, this session will cover federal guidelines that shape research participation, associated protections for vulnerable populations, and how those guidelines can impact the diversity of research populations. Then we'll learn about the NIH's new strategic plan for DEIA and how it translates to funding cycles and opportunities for applicants to enhance this in their health research. And then finally, we will hear from PCORI on their comparative effectiveness research portfolio supporting DEIA, along with innovations in diversifying site and patient recruitment. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Jason for his first part.
Thank you, Jennifer, and happy to be here. So I'm going to go over, why diversity and inclusion is important, and some of the benefits and some of the roadblocks that have, prevented certain groups or populations of groups to participate in research. And I'm also going to add some of the legal and regulatory requirements on top of that, just so you've got a, sort of an idea as to where some of this is going, because honestly, there's a lot of guidance and guidelines that are coming out from both the FDA and the NIH in this area. And this has been driven by some actual legislation that's come out of Congress, in particular the omnibus bill at the funding bill at the end of last year. And I'm going to touch upon some of the FDA stuff briefly at the very end. But diversity and inclusion in research has historically been the focus of NIH and other regulators, but it hasn't been until recently there's been a push to really add real guidance and substantive support to ensure that certain types of populations are included in the research. And the reason that's important is that historically has been typically folks necessarily with the disease or the disease area that have been represented in studies, and a lot of those barriers are not only just the way that studies have been organized, whether it be inclusion and exclusion criteria, but also access and accessibility. And I think that's really an important issue when it comes to thinking about diversity and inclusion in research. And the FDA is trying to address some of those issues through recent guidance on decentralized clinical trials. And so, when we talk about diversity and inclusion in research, I think the first question is always, well, diverse how, right? And so I think what we're learning is that, ultimately there's a lot of different ways to think about diversity and inclusion in research. And it's very important to think about diversity and inclusion in many different ways. So it's not just gender or race or ethnicity. And I think, as Dr. Bernard is going to talk about, there's a socioeconomic aspect to this when you talk about health disparities in certain types of populations. And so I think we're at a really good juncture in research to where people are starting to have these open conversations and substantive thoughts and conversations as a way to really think about, well, how do I want to, go about inclusion, and what does that mean, and how can I actually effectuate those changes? And so, I think, the first question is always, who is it that I'm trying to include? And to be quite honest, I think that question really goes to, well, what population are you trying to support, right? So again, if you go to the next slide, for example, when you talk about Alzheimer's research, right? So African Americans are twice as likely as non-Hispanic whites to be diagnosed as Alzheimer's, right? But African Americans and Hispanic folks, even though they make up 30% of the population, they are only 6% of all participants in federally funded trials from this 2018 study, or 2020 study, I should say. And so what you have is that you have a population involved in these research studies. They don't necessarily represent the population that has the disease. And the reason that's a problem is that the different races and ethnicities and socioeconomic groups come to the table with different comorbidities and different environmental impacts that may actually create differences in how the drug affects them, as well as how adverse events may affect them, right? Because if you're not studying the drug in the population, you're going to miss potentially seeing what drug-drug interactions are going to have when you think about the actual patient population. That's, for example, maybe there's a large percentage of folks with Alzheimer's that also have diabetes, right? And so they may be taking certain types of medication. And so if you're not putting those people into the clinical research study, you may not be able to see the trends or the issues that may go along with giving this Alzheimer's drug that you're studying to that patient population that has diabetes and maybe using, 1, 2, or 3 of the most popular diabetes drugs. So not only is it important from just a pure access perspective to give opportunities to folks that traditionally have not had opportunities to be on the cutting edge in these research studies to get the most advanced medicines, but you're also missing the opportunity to see how it's really truly going to affect that population when the drug is actually on the market. And I know many of you are aware of the black box warnings that have come out on things like Vioxx after the fact. And part of the reason that occurred is because Number one, the data and information that was available wasn't robust enough to make the correlation, because the study wasn't really in the population necessarily that was going to take the drug the most. And so again, I think as we start thinking about these issues and increasing the amount of diversity and inclusion, it's really important to focus, well, on the important part, which is we're giving this drug to a certain population, and we need to make sure that we're studying them as part of the group when we're doing the clinical research, so we have a better and a more robust idea as to how this is going to affect those types of folks in the real world. And so this is even more important if we go to a couple of slides down, because we're looking at such a small portion of the population when you're looking at clinical research, that it becomes, really important to have a plan in place to make sure that you are enrolling the types of individuals in the study that are really going to see this drug in the real world. And because there is, we're not doing clinical studies on 100,000 people, right? It's usually around 2,000 to 4,000 people, depending on what phase you're in. It is critically important to make sure that you're including the right types of people into your clinical research study. And as we're going to see, the way the FDA is addressing this is that they are requiring an action plan to be put in place to really address the diversity issue. NIH also has that requirement when it comes to reporting outcomes. And so again, what this should do is it should make people think about this at the front end of a study instead of at the back end when they're trying to put the data and information together. Because what's going to happen is if you don't think about this at the front end, you may not be able to meet the requirements of the FDA or the NIH. And so again, this is just a list of some of the reasons that the diversity in research is important. I mentioned some of these already, but I think the number 3 is also really important, because again, when you're thinking about different populations from different races, different ethnicities, different genders, different socioeconomic classes, medical treatments are going to likely be disparate as well. And so what is going to be important is understanding how this drug is really going to work in that individual's, in that patient population that's going to be taking the drug. So the next slide is just some, additional sort of high level issues that, is a reason why it's important to, the benefits of diversity in research. But I mean, ultimately, this is about the patient, right? And so, but what we do know is that there has been historically a hesitation on the part of certain groups of individuals to actually participate in research. And so one of the issues that you're going to have to address is not only come up with a good plan as to how I'm going to enroll patients, but making sure that you can actually convince those patients to be part of the study. What we have here is some of the more, I think, egregious research related sort of issues that have come up over the time of research has been conducted, and has created both hesitation and fear in certain patient populations, starting with the Tuskegee syphilis study all the way through the New York Psychiatric Institute, the fluoramine experiment. So and this became even more prevalent in COVID, and being in New York City, I can tell you that it was a big issue and a big discussion on the news about vaccine hesitancy in the African American population here in New York, and how local hospitals, and I did some work at the New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation here to really try to get around some of those issues and deal with the patient engagement part of this. And when you talk with these folks, there's a lot of hesitancy and a lot of fear based upon the historical acts that have happened, where people really did not take into account and really protect these patients that were becoming part of these research studies. And so whenever you're thinking about diversity and inclusion, you have to think about how you're actually going to engage these folks. And again, what we're thinking about is we should be thinking about the barriers that have historically, come into play when folks have not been wanted to be involved in research. If you go to the next slide, this is just a list of some of the actual issues that you need to consider when you're thinking about trying to enroll patients from certain groups into these studies. There's cultural differences, linguistic differences, which is actually a fairly big deal. And again, going from my own experience in New York, there's, in certain parts of the city, there's, either bigger populations of Chinese or Hispanic. And so, when you're thinking about enrolling patients in the study, the linguistic barrier is a huge barrier, right? And making sure that you have available resources to be able to explain in someone's language, as well as someone that can answer questions that may be related to what their culture is, and being able to understand when someone asks a very particular question, how that's culturally relevant, so you can answer in a way that you can put them at ease, and that you can actively try to get their participation in the study. And so again, there are these barriers, but turning over to the legal and regulatory side, if we go to the next slide, what you see is at the federal level, starting with NIH and now with the FDA, they are trying to ensure that these issues are thought about and discussed up front when it comes to diversity and inclusion. The NIH has designated these subgroups, as you see here on the next slide, as health disparity. And so when we talk about health disparity, the definition here is at the bottom. What we're talking about is it's a group that's adversely disadvantaged, right, based upon health outcomes. And in fact, the NIH has several health disparity populations. There's racial and ethnic minority groups, socioeconomic status, underserved rural communities, and sexual and gender minority groups. And I'm sure Dr. Bernard is going to get more in depth in this, so I won't speak on that too much. But the reason these groups have been created and that exist is that these are the types of groups that people should be thinking about trying to address when you're trying to enroll folks into the research programs, right? So you're not only talking about gender and sexuality and race, but you also need to think about health disparity populations. So again, when it comes to like socioeconomic status and things like this. On the next slide, like I said, and I won't go too in depth into this, the NIH has been trying to address this issue since the early 90s, starting with the NIH Revitalization Act. And then, here I have the Minority Health and Health Disparity Strategic Plan. Dr. Bernard is going to talk about the DEIA Strategic Plan. Again, these are all opportunities for groups that are doing the research to really think about what it is that their plan and their goal is going to be, in ensuring that these groups are enrolled appropriately in research. And so, goal 7, for example, in the Minority Health and Health Disparity plan that I have here, is to ensure appropriate representation of minority and other health disparity populations, as mentioned in the last slide. And goal 8 is to actually promote evidence-based community engagement, dissemination, and implementation of minority health and health disparity research best practices. Again, it's not only engaging these folks, but promoting ways to ensure that there is engagement and dissemination of information in order to assist in the both the dissemination of information that comes from research, as well as to help folks think about how to bring these types of populations into research themselves in their local communities. And so finally, just to touch on this briefly, because I know there's a lot to talk about, but not a lot of time. And so I just want to mention briefly the FDA guidance on improving both diversity in clinical trials, and really the guidance that came out just a few weeks back on decentralized clinical trials. And what you'll see in my slides is that I've got some additional information on, what the legal and regulatory side of this is, and along with a few ideas and issues to think about when it comes to how do you actually address the problem, because it's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to address it. But one thing I did want to mention is that the FDA has, and this really started with COVID, with hybrid clinical trials, right? The FDA is really having folks rethink a couple of things. One is that when you think about your inclusion and exclusion criteria, when you're drafting your protocol, are you somehow disproportionately already excluding certain types of populations by including exclusion criteria that may actually be something that the large majority of the population that has the disease has already? So you may be, decreasing your ability to include a diverse and inclusive population in your research just by your inclusion exclusion criteria. So it is important that when you're drafting your protocol, that you really think about the patient population that you're trying to treat and what their comorbidities are likely to be, and whether or not you can remove certain exclusion criteria in order to increase the amount of diversity that you can actually have when you bring in your patient population. The other is with decentralized clinical trials. I think there's a lot of thought that's going into the capability of a couple of things. One is that allowing people to collect information on their own at home, or actually doing some of the study work at someone's house or their place of work, using local healthcare providers. And again, one of the issues with certain types of populations is that if you're working a job, from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., you don't really necessarily get sick days off, you don't get time off. It's really hard for you to participate if you can't get there and be part of the study. So thinking of alternative ways to allow these folks to participate that doesn't interfere with their daily lives, to the point where they either are not going to be able to get paid for certain time to go, or they may not be able to participate because they're afraid that if they leave their job or place of work, they may not be able to, they may get in trouble for it. The other is transportation. A lot of people don't think about transportation, but it's very key, right? So if you live or work on one part of town and it takes you a bus 20 minutes to get to the hospital, you do your work in 20 minutes back, you may not have 2 hours in your day to be able to, to do that study, right? So it's opening up opportunities at night, perhaps, to do certain types of study related collections, or again, thinking of creative ways to allow these folks to participate by doing like a decentralized collection. So I know I'm going to stop there. I can talk a lot more. I apologize for talking so fast, but there's a lot that's going on here. But I think I think Jennifer, someone put my information in the chat. So if you feel free to reach out. I am going to give this same talk in Phoenix in about a month at the healthcare compliance and ethics conference, and so I'll give a fuller talk there if people are going to be there. But thank you so much for the time.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. I really appreciate that presentation and setting the groundwork for us, for Dr. Bernard to share a little bit about more specifically about the NIH's new strategic plan for DEIA. So I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Bernard.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to talk about the DEIA strategic plan and specifically what it should mean for researchers. Next slide. Our strategic plan was released on March 20th of this year. It represents a year and a half of work that was done by more than 100 volunteers across NIH. Next. It was propelled by two forces. In the fiscal year 21 budget resolution for NIH, the law, it called for us to develop a strategic plan to include short and long-term goals to address racial, ethnic, and gender disparities at NIH, and to identify and address barriers in access to NIH funding by investigators researching health disparities. In addition, when the Biden administration came on board in January of 2021, they issued an executive order that called for all federal agencies to develop a diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility plan for the federal workforce. So we combined those two goals in this plan. Next. As I said, there are more than 100 representatives from all the institutes and centers across NIH. I had the privilege of co-leading this with my colleagues, the Director of the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and the Director of the Office of Human Resources. This was managed by an internal group called DEIA, the Division of Program Coordination, Planning, and Strategic Initiatives. And all of this was vetted through a committee called the DEIA Working Group, representative of leaders across NIH who gave really critical input as to what's feasible, what's not feasible, et cetera. Next slide. The mission, as enunciated in the plan, is to embrace, strengthen, and integrate diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, from here on I'll say DEIA, across all NIH activities in the service of our mission, And we have a vision of being a people-centered organization where workforce and research priorities reflect our nation's diversity and all people have a sense of belonging as they advance our mission. Next. We do this by 3 main objectives. And as you look at these objectives, you'll see that the first 2 are very people focused and the last one is a research objective. The usual thing from NIH is the other. You'd have the research first and then the people focus, but because this is so important to people, we thought this should be represented differently. Next. This is a plan that is an umbrella for everything that we're doing across NIH in the DEIA space. Every one of the institutes and centers are doing things. We have a minority in health and health disparities strategic plan that's NIH-wide. We have a tribal health research plan. We have a women's health research plan. We have a COSWID plan. We have a sex, gender, minority plan. All of this is encompassed in this DEIA strategic plan. Next. The goals that are research goals are shown here. To expand research to identify promising practices for enhancing DEIA in the biomedical and behavioral workforce. To expand research to identify and remove potential barriers to the implementation and expansion of promising and effective DEIA practices, policies, and procedures. And to examine how enhancing DEIA in the biomedical and behavioral workforce influences the accomplishment of the NIH mission. Very lofty goals, and we are currently looking very carefully at all the subjectives related to this, who owns what among the many people here at NIH and how we move this forward for implementation. Next. We want to promote research to identify health disparities and examine the factors that drive these disparities, develop, adapt, test, and disseminate effective interventions to improve health and reduce health disparities, and promote the consideration of DEIA in all NIH-supported research and research-sustaining activities. Much of this overlaps with the minority health and health disparities strategic plan, and so we point to that when we talk about these things in Objective 3.2. Next. So some current activities and things to be aware of. There's the NIH Unite initiative. Next. This is something that came about as a result of the events of 2020, where we saw disparate morbidity and mortality with the COVID pandemic, and we all saw the videotaped murder of George Floyd. It was officially unveiled at a special meeting of the advisory committee to the director on February 26th of 2021, and the very next month we saw the killings of 6 Asian women in Atlanta. Next. This led to our spending a lot of time thinking the summer of 2020 and recognizing the issues of racial and ethnic injustice in our country. And we came to the conclusion that we could not be silent. This is the case for many across the country. And we developed a shared commitment to address structural racism in the biomedical research enterprise. As you can see, we have this audacious URL at the bottom of ending structural racism. We recognize that we're not responsible for all of the factors associated with structural racism, but we have a bully pulpit as the largest funder of biomedical and behavioral research in the country, and we are looking at what we can do in that ecosystem to address things. Next. So the NIH Unite initiative, UNITE, represents 5 interacting work groups that focus on the content areas that are shown in the Venn diagram. This is all people-focused and data-driven work in health disparities, minority health research, looking at our own internal workforce, making sure that we are role modeling what we expect of the external academic and research institutions. I did not include a slide about what we're doing in health disparity and minority health research space, but hopefully you're all very aware of the Community Partnerships to Advance Science for Society, or the COMPASS initiative. This is over the course of 10 years going to be a $400 million investment in working at the community level to address problems that have been identified by communities that lead to disparities. Some 25 different communities will be selected. The applications are in. There was a very robust response to this. 5 academic institutions will be selected to work with these various communities, but the communities will be driving it in terms of what they would like to have addressed. And there'll be an overall coordinating committee that's a combination of academics and community leaders to make sure that, again, we're looking at what the people in the community expect. All of those applications are in the reviews, and the funding lists are being finalized. I don't bring it to you as a funding opportunity, but I just want to make sure you're aware of it. Of the things that are going on, next slide, please. For the external workforce, however, you should be aware of the Faculty Institutional Recruitment for Sustainable Transformation Initiative. This is a program that replicates something that's been done successfully within NIH, something that's called the Distinguished Scholars Program, where we bring in groups of early career scientists who have an interest in and a track record in DEIA. It's not necessarily their focus for their research, it's their avocation in most cases, but they get extra mentoring, extra support. There is attention to the environment in the institute or center in which they are working, and it's been associated with increased diversity of our tenure track program when you look at sex, race, and ethnicity. Not exclusively people who may come from underrepresented racial ethnic group, not exclusively women, but it's associated with an increase. And thus, this is being replicated outside of NIH. The first group of cohorts was funded in fiscal year 21. You see high resource institutions, low resource institutions, a collaboration between Tuskegee University, University of Alabama at Birmingham. Next. The second set of cohorts from fiscal year 22, again, high resource institutions, low resource institutions, a collaboration between University of Maryland and Baltimore and University of Maryland. Next. Has a coordinating center at Morehouse School of Medicine. And the last set of cohorts will hopefully be announced in the next, by the beginning of June. At the end of that, we'll have 15 of these across the country, about 150 early career scientists who are going to be brought in as a group, supported, and we'll see whether this translates into their successfully attaining tenure and getting R01 funding from NIH. We also have something called the Science Education Partnership Awards Program. It's been in place for a long period of time and has been led by the National Institute of General Medical Sciences. It's a program for K through 12 STEM education. It has been broadened to 17 institute centers and offices supporting it. We only have 24 funding ICs at NIH, so most of them are supporting this to provide broader opportunities, because we recognize science identity is often developed as early as middle school. We also have something called research with activities related to diversity opportunity. This is an opportunity to support scientists who do a lot in the way of mentoring and other DEIA activities, but don't currently have NIH funding. It will help to support their research, help them to continue doing what they've been doing very well from the DEIA perspective. We also next have an instrumentation grant program for resource limited institutions. We have a separate one just in general, but this is focused on resource limited institutions, which often includes historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, and others who just don't have the opportunity to build things in the way that your highly funded institutions have. Next. And we have this NOFO that has a long name. I'm glad they have the acronym strong. Strengthening research opportunities for NIH grants, structured institutional needs assessment and action plan development for resource limited institutions. Basically to give those institutions that have not, again, been highly funded by NIH the opportunity to step back, see what it is that they need, and to develop an action plan. Next. We also have concepts that have been approved, and hopefully you're very aware that once a concept is approved by an advisory council or an institute or center at NIH, in the vast majority of cases, it ends up as a notice of funding opportunity. So there's an institutional climate assessment and DEIA action plan development grant opportunity that's under development. It's going to allow academic and research institutions who are successful to replicate the first initiative. It doesn't give the money for bringing in the cohorts, but it gives the money to look at the climate. And I could envision institutions going to philanthropic sources to put those together, and they basically have a first grant. We have a research capacity building program to enhance workforce diversity that's under development. It's going to be probably focused at resource limited institutions. Next. And we have an institutional research capacity building needs assessment and action plan development grant that's under development. Next. And very importantly, I hope that you're all very aware of this. We have a prize competition for institutional excellence in DEIA. The total purse is $1 million. We envision, my team is leading this on behalf of the 24 funding institutes and centers and NIH Unite initiative. And we envision giving up to 10 awards, $100,000 each to 10 institutions, up to five of them being resource limited institutions. Next. And the intent here is to recognize and reward institutions that have identified gaps in DEIA and designed effective interventions that potentially are generalizable. Next. Key dates, it was released April 4th. We just had a webinar. If you're interested, that webinar should be on the website at this point, the videotape of it. The applications are due by September 26th. We anticipate announcing the awardees by December of this year. Next. So those are some examples of things that we see coming from the DEIA strategic plan. Because it is a framework to guide us over the next 5 years, you can anticipate more things will be coming out. We're really grateful to all the people who helped to develop this and to the people outside of NIH who responded to the RFI, who participated in our webinars. Next. And I really invite you, if you want to get further elaboration on any of the things I said, to just go to the diversity.nih.gov site, which is a COSWID site, or Google NIH Unite, and you'll find more information there.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bernard. I really appreciate you sharing all of the abundant opportunities to really advance the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in our research here at Penn State. Hopefully those were some new opportunities for some of the folks that have joined our webinar today to think about pursuing. I'm going to segue now to Dr. Wang.
Thank you so much. And Marie and Jason, it's wonderful to hear your perspectives, and also really impressed by NIH's organization and efforts to really move our agenda forward. I'm going to speak a little bit on behalf of PCORI, and next slide. For some of you who might not be as familiar with PCORI, so PCORI is a government-funded, but actually a private nonprofit that was developed around the time of the ACA, and its mandate was to help people make informed healthcare decisions and improve healthcare delivery and outcomes by producing and promoting high-integrity evidence-based information that comes from research that's guided by patients, caregivers, and the broader healthcare community. And that last part is really highlighted because that really is the core of what PCORI funds from a CER standpoint. So we're trying to increase the quantity, quality, and timeliness of useful, trustworthy research information to help patients, caregivers, and other stakeholders support their healthcare decisions. And we also want to make sure that this evidence gets into practice as quickly as possible. And hopefully we inspire others to fund research that is more patient-centered as well. So on the next slide, I'm just to kind of catch folks up, there has been recently an update in our national priorities for health. This happened in 2022, and our board adopted 5 interconnected and synergistic national priorities for health that are really centered on trying to achieve patient-centered health. And one that I'm going to call out for you is an explicit one that aims to achieve health equity, and trying to do this by supporting and expanding stakeholder engagement, research, as well as dissemination to try to achieve health equity. Next slide, please. So what you'll see here are the named, and long-standing focus areas for us as we think about addressing healthcare needs and disparities. And so you'll see the groups that are that have been named in our portfolio analysis and funding announcements so far. And on the right-hand side, especially in the red circle, you'll see that a lot of our portfolio to date has focused on these groups, specifically racial and ethnic groups, as well as low-income women, older adults, and individuals with multiple chronic comorbidities. And as you take a quick dive into the portfolio as well, next slide, you'll see that there are intervention strategies that really that we funded that really are working towards eliminating health disparities. And you'll see that they range from the left from interventions and how workforce is deployed across different delivery models that don't necessarily involve healthcare institutions per se. And then on the far right, some of the things like technology and other clinical practice mechanisms that can be used to try to eliminate these types of health disparities. Engagement is very much a focus of what we are, what we support here at PCORI. And there's definitely been some lessons learned as we think about DEIA in engagement. We know that in general, engagement is a very good thing, especially from a research standpoint. It helps facilitate recruitment into clinical trials and retention overall. We believe that it's never too late to start engaging patients and communities and other stakeholders. But sometimes one of the key ingredients to engagement is trustworthiness, and trust that is often one of the barriers for not only the conduct of the science, but also being able to support access to clinical trials and being able to meet underserved populations in their community, and being able to, appropriately utilize the expertise of trusted community brokers here. So many of these are very important lessons that we've learned from an engagement standpoint. So when we're talking about DEIA in research, we often frame this not only from a workforce standpoint, but also from a workforce that is partnering very strongly with us in the delivery of research. And so, as we think about patient and caregiver opportunities to engage in not only defining which questions are important, we're also engaging these individuals to help us conduct and in many ways disseminate the science that results from here. And so on the slide, you'll see many ways that we encourage patient and caregivers to be able to participate in the conduct of the science and in the operationalization of the research plan. Starting from the beginning, when we're sort of thinking about study inclusion and exclusion criteria, as well as thinking about all of the study processes to ensure feasibility. But also on the back end, there are things that we typically think of as perhaps being more in the scientific domain that we encourage our investigators to continue to engage with patient and caregiver stakeholders to make sure that what we have here is very meaningful and can be introduced into practice readily, and that people are understanding what this research is about and is for, and being able to deploy it that way. So as you think about these opportunities to engage patient and caregivers, when I was starting out in research, I was perhaps more on the left-hand side of this graphic, where we would often go to patients and caregivers and seek input. And these input might be sought through things like focus groups or pilots or surveys or roundtables, where, I patted myself on the back and said, hey, this is great. I'm getting great feedback. But as, my career evolved, and especially now that I've landed at PCORI and seen what other folks have been doing, it's really, we're really aiming towards more of the right-hand side of the slide, where we're thinking about consultation, where we're working side by side with our patients and caregiver stakeholders, and seeking active feedback and advice and consulting them on decisions, or even better, collaborating, where we're actually jointly making decisions and taking actions jointly, or even a shared leadership model where there are independent initiatives, but they're all in service to the research that we are conducting together. And, a quick note about compensation: the compensation really should be commensurate with the contribution of these diverse stakeholders and their inputs into the science here. So next slide gives you a sense of some of the tools that you may or may not find helpful here, that we've furnished in our toolkits to be able to engage non-scientist participants on research, and to be able to build effective research teams that include very experienced researchers, such as many of you that are on this webinar, but also to be able to effectively include folks who are either new to research, or who are new to clinical, to even sort of the clinical trial landscape or the healthcare landscape in general, to be able to leverage all of these voices and being able to effectively incorporate diversity considerations into research design and conduct. So if you were to ask me to summarize what are the major PCORI initiatives in DEIA, I think, as I've mentioned now over the last several minutes, there is a huge emphasis on engaging diverse and patient-centered input in a trustworthy manner, and also to be able to capacity build in that area here. We've also focused on this from a health systems implementation perspective, where we've pulled together health systems that serve DEI populations and think about sort of the unique needs of delivering healthcare within that system. There's been a tremendous amount of infrastructure efforts. So I'll give you an example of PCORNet, which is a research network. But this is a network that's very large, and many of its constituents are, in fact, safety net or community-based organizations or federally qualified healthcare centers and minority-serving institutions. So trying to be able to leverage our infrastructure to be able to expand efforts in DEIA. And then, of course, people always ask about our application processes. And here's where we're using very purposeful DEI planning and delivering the required training where possible. This is very much incorporated into our merit review processes. And in the next two slides, I'm going to just touch on some of the particular funding opportunities that you might find interesting as in support of DEIA. So the first one is one where I believe our first cycle, the deadline is today. So if you need to hit submit, please submit. But this is one where we're actually taking existing PCORI awards that are currently in sort of the early phases and asking these investigators whether or not there are things that they could do to really enhance the diversity of their study participants, whether it's being able to enhance their recruitment methods or strategies, or whether it is trying to get to a sample size that's large enough to be able to allow for effective heterogeneity of treatment effect analyses, and matching that up with a budget that allows people to do something substantive so that they can move the needle on enhancing diversity in their research. The next slide gives you an example of something, for example, that we heard in the maternal health space, where we were getting stakeholder input suggesting tremendous disparities in maternal health outcomes, and that a lot of that care was actually not necessarily focused on the health system delivery of care, but in partnership with community organizations and individuals that facilitate the transition from the peripartum period to the postpartum period. And so it triggered this understanding that if we really wanted to move the needle on maternal health outcomes, this kind of research should be done in full partnership with the communities. And so this is a funding award opportunity where community organizations are offered a leadership role as a co-PI with the research organization. In fact, it's a requirement. So they're fully participating in decision-making alongside the research organization. And the planning of the award is in several phases. One, to really try to make sure that the relationship is gelled and working well as they're kicking off their research activities. And then there is a research conduct period that allows these two groups to be able to kick off, hopefully, a productive research phase that allows them to address maternal outcomes. So for many of you who are wondering how to further engage with PCORI, especially from a DEIA perspective, I would say that there are many opportunities to be able to do so, and they're listed on the slide, and I'm happy to share these slides with you afterwards so that you can get access to the links. And then in the final slide, I will basically end here by saying that, there are quite a few resources on our website that allows you to think about funding announcements and to think about engagement resources and rubric for being able to enhance the diversity of your research team, as well as the participants in your research. And, we've been working on our DEI strategy here at PCORI. And so, on the right-hand side is just a little graphic showing how we're thinking about doing research differently, broadening our reach, and being able to have a action-oriented and a learning culture as we continue to advance our agenda in this area. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jennifer.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Wang. Again, wonderful opportunities and work being done from PCORI that hopefully were new opportunities for those of you that have joined. We're going to segue now into our Q&A so we can field any questions you may have placed in our Q&A, and I will pull those up. And then if you have any more questions from the chat, please feel free to type them in there as well. Doesn't look like we have any questions yet. So hopefully everyone is just processing all the information that's starting. Oh, we have one question that just came in. Will the NIH start prioritizing funding for research in areas that can better access underserved populations? In other words, if there is a homogeneous population, will the researcher be penalized?
So as Mr. Johnson pointed out, NIH has had policies in place for quite a while that calls for populations that are representative of the disease entity that's being evaluated. We recently re-evaluated those policies and developed a new one called Inclusion Across the Lifespan to make sure that there are children and older adults included in studies to allow them to be representative. And there are periodic re-evaluations of how subject populations are distributed, and really progressively more aggressive monitoring during the course of projects, because one of the big challenges we've run into is that many times you don't really have a good sense of fully who is in a study until the study is complete, and we don't have much control after the study is complete. We're no longer funding, but the larger institutes and centers like the National Institute on Aging, where I used to be the deputy, National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Allergy and Immunology and Infectious Diseases, have special systems in place to allow monitoring as subjects are being accrued. And NIH-wide, we're looking at trying to get systems in place to make sure that every institute and center is able to do that almost real-time monitoring as opposed to waiting for after the fact. If progress reports, for instance, show that recruitment is suboptimal, there's the opportunity to negotiate with the researcher. And I've seen instances where monies have been withheld until a solid plan is put in place to have an appropriate distribution of subjects. So those are the sorts of things that we have in place and that we'll probably see a lot more of going forward.
And just briefly from the FDA perspective, so the FDA has the diversity plan requirement, which I think touches on the question as well. Recognizing that it may not be possible or feasible given the patient population that you're studying, for example, rare diseases, right? You may not be able to really do a diverse population. The FDA has the capability to remove the requirement for a diversity plan. You just have to justify it. And so Dr. Bernard, I don't know if the NIH has something similar, but I would assume that, if you're looking at a rare disease and you can justify, limiting the, the diversity of the population based upon what you're studying, it would probably be something I would think NIH would consider.
Absolutely. Our review panels, peer review panelers are asked to look at what's being proposed in research and look at the subject population that is the projected population to determine whether it's appropriate for the disease that's being considered. So yes, if it's a rare disease, it's a different sort of consideration than, for instance, if it's Alzheimer's disease, which is very common. And as you pointed out, we don't have adequate representation yet in Alzheimer's studies.
Excellent, thank you. We have a few more questions that have filtered in and some comments. Thank you so much for these incredibly informative talks. We appreciate you sharing your expertise with our institution. What do you see as the most successful next steps individual researchers can take to advance this important area?
I'm happy to go first. I think it's this and having conversations, right? I think that there's a lot of stakeholders involved here, right? And so, I'm sure Dr. Wayne can talk about this as, a practicing physician and when she mentioned her focus groups, right? I mean, it's really having the conversations with all the folks that are involved in the research to sort of open up the thought process and the idea to understand that, it is important to include these folks and to have the conversations is the best way to do that, right? We don't operate in a vacuum, right? So we operate with real world patients in different areas. And so, particularly with academic medical centers that may have, community hospitals and community centers outside sort of the city center, I think it's important to have, this conversation sort of across the board because, the local physician is going to know their patient and patient population better than anyone else. And so it's really this to me, it's like understanding this is important and we should start discussing it and having these conversations to come up with, plans and ideas to help the actual patients and to understand what the barriers are for, the participation.
And I would add to that, that you should also try to make sure that your team has diverse perspectives, because when you have individuals who come from a community that you're targeting, they will have a better understanding many times of what's being said as the concerns. They'll have different perspectives about how you should go about the research that may be really useful. So I think you need to be at front of consciousness thinking about including a diverse population in studies and hearing what those populations say are their needs. You need diverse scientists helping you to design that study as well.
Great, thank you. And there's a third question that came in that is similar to the first question posed. Can an NIH researcher justify a more homogeneous sample in order to focus on disparities, for example, a rural sample?
It depends upon the question that's being asked. If the question is very specifically something like what's an effective intervention for prostate cancer in African-American men, absolutely, you could do that. If you're asking a broader question, then you need to have a broader population. So it really depends upon the question that you're asking.
Great, thank you all so much. It looks like we just have another minute left, and I was hoping to reserve that for our crowdsourcing. So just thinking of next steps for Penn State, as a whole, what can we do to increase DEI efforts in research across our organization? And if you don't mind just popping into chat some thoughts, and we will use that as a springboard for a follow-up session to this, as we really try to explore with our leaders in diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility here at Penn State, how we can advance these efforts. And while folks are doing that, I just want to thank again our guest speakers, Mr. Jason Johnson, Dr. Marie Bernard, and Dr. Tracy Wang, for your time and dedication to this important work that you're doing. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We'll make sure that all of the session materials will be made available. And we will also be sending out the session recording and an evaluation. Have a wonderful day.